Good evening, everybody. I didn't know I was going to be speaking tonight, but I've been asked to, so I will. After all, I enjoy speaking. Speaking is my job. I thought, given that I have no other inspiration at short notice, I'd talk to you about the police in the UK, because you may or may not be aware that I was a policeman for 10... That's better with the mic, isn't it? Just testing that you are awake, and how you deal with this little fiddy there. So I was going to say that I haven't been asked to speak, but I'm speaking anyway because apparently Joe is a bit late. So I'm going to talk to you about something dear to my heart and which I know a lot about, the British police. Because as you may or may not know, I was a policeman for 10 years before I became an interpreter. In fact, just as an anecdote, I have just recently met the only other person, to my knowledge, who has been a policeman and is about to be an interpreter, and he's studying here at the KU Leuven. He retired from the Belgian Gendarmerie and is now doing a one-year course, so he'll soon be an also ex-police interpreter. Anyway, what happened was, after university, I did a master's and a PhD at university in Cambridge, and I didn't know what to do by way of a job. Hello, Joe. Good evening. And my mother saw an advert in the paper for the British police. She said, why don't you become a policeman? And it had never occurred to me. It's not the sort of job that really most people with doctorates go for, but I thought I'd have a look because it sounded quite interesting. And I went for the interview and I got accepted as what they call a graduate entrant, because in those days, this was back in 1978, would you believe, the British police were looking to up the ratio of graduates to increase the brain power of the British police, a job which, by the way, still requires doing, I think. Anyway, they were very keen and red-hot keen to have graduates, so they extended the hand of friendship to me and said I could join. And I signed on to join the Cambridgeshire Constabulary because I wanted to stay in Cambridge. Now, you may or may not be aware that in the UK there are about 50 different police forces. You know that in Belgium they have the Police Unie, but in England they have different police forces that are semi-independent. Most of them are based on county areas. So the Cambridgeshire Constabulary obviously policed Cambridgeshire. The headquarters of the constabulary being in Peterborough. I was actually seconded to the Cambridge police station, which, as you probably know, stars in a series of novels by someone called Alison Bruce, who wrote a series of books about the Cambridge police, the hero being called Duncan Goodhue, and I recommend that you try them, they're very good. Anyway, it was quite an eye-opener. I do recall the first time I went for an interview and I sat down in the office of the superintendent at the Cambridge police station, and he said, why are you sitting down? I said, well, why not? He said, well, we're not at university anymore. You sit down if you're told to. You stand unless you're told you can sit down. And that was a bit of a cold shower because I had no idea, of course, that the ethos in the police was extraordinarily different from the ethos at Cambridge University. Not quite the same sort of thing at all. And so that gave me a good idea of what to expect. The initial training lasted 10 weeks, and I was sent down to a training centre near Oxford called Eynsham Hall. I still recall it. It is branded on my soul. Any of you who have seen G.I. Jane and various other films about training for the military will realise that it was that sort of thing, like a boot camp. It was a veritable boot camp. I do recall primarily that the gym instructor would make us run about 7 or 8 miles at dawn before we had breakfast. And we had to carry about 20 or 25 kilos in weight, and we had to go through the rain and the sleet and the snow and the mud and ford rivers and everything else. And this was, again, quite a culture shock after having spent 7 years at Cambridge University. And he used to follow us and he'd say, it's only pain, it can't hurt you. But he was wrong, it did hurt. Although I do use that dictum actually in my stress classes for interpreters. It's only pain, it can't hurt you. And so if you're experiencing pain in the booth now, poor Sarah is definitely suffering, I can see. I am actually speaking slowly. And you're Spanish, so you can't talk. In fact, Sarah, I suffered at the hands of 3 Spaniards today at NATO. And I hate the Spaniards, but not you. I just hate the Spanish at NATO. To come back to what I was saying, the initial training course lasted 10 weeks. And we covered virtually everything. We covered the law, obviously, criminal law, traffic law, property law. We covered how to deal with incidents involving traffic accidents, domestic scenes. That's not actually English. Domestic disputes. virtually anything you might come across, using knife fights, fights involving guns. We weren't initially trained in firearms because, as you probably know, the British police do not by default train their officers in firearms use. Joe, this computer's gone dark. Is that normal? Do you think it's still working?
I think it
Okay, good. I trained in firearms use later when I went back to Cambridge. Anyway, it was very intensive. We only had about 5 hours sleep a night. And the legal side was quite easy for me because I had a bit of an academic brain, and for me it was pretty easy. That was the hard bit for most of the recruits. What was hard for me was the physical side, and also the side where you had to take orders from idiots. And that is one of the primary factors in the British police, or any police force, I think, in that you have to take orders, and that came rather hard to me, and in fact still does. I will go later into the reasons why I left the police, that being one of them. Anyway, it was extremely exciting. I learned a lot about human nature. They had this, I used to ask a lot of questions, and they don't like you asking questions, because I wanted always to know why you had to do something, and that is not encouraged in the police. You're supposed to do it because you're told to do it. And so I stand up in the classroom and ask questions, which I think were intelligent questions. Maybe they weren't, but the instructors didn't always appreciate them. And they came up in the fourth week of the course with an acronym, a 3-letter acronym, which they would use whenever I stood up. They would say SDC. And the first time I asked, well, what does that mean, sir? He would say, sit down, cunt.
Not Chris.
No, not Chris, no. No, the police, they're not refined, shall we say. So I'll give you the full fat version. And after that, I knew what SDC meant. And when I heard SDC, I sat down and shut up. So I, in fact, did learn to shut up. After the 10-week initial training, I was a constable. And let me go shortly into the ranks in the British police now. This will be difficult for you interpreters because there are no equivalents in European mainland countries, because all the police in the European mainland countries are paramilitary in nature. So there are no equivalents, so good luck with this. I could tell you, in fact, that in the French police, for example, you start by being an agent, and then you go up to being a commissaire. And that is the bottom and the top of the range of ranks. So that gives you an idea. In the British police, you have very few ranks. There is constable, which is the primary rank. I should add, by the way, that you remain a constable throughout your entire life. If you get promoted, you're still a constable, because this is part of the common law concept of British policing, where the police are always constables. Then they add on to that any ranks they may acquire. So after constable, you become a sergeant, which is where you have 3 stripes on your shoulder. Then you become an inspector. Then you become a chief inspector. Then you become a superintendent. Then you become a chief superintendent. And then you become a commissioner if it's in the Metropolitan Police, or a chief constable if you're in one of the county forces. Now, you may or may not be aware that there is a big difference between the Metropolitan Police, as in Scotland Yard, or in this case, New Scotland Yard, and all the county police forces, of which there are, as I said, about 50. New Scotland Yard is much more go-getting, much more high profile. The work is the same. What you should also realise is that in the British police, unlike any police force in the world apart from the British police, you always start at the bottom. So the fact that I had a PhD didn't mean I could start at any rank other than that of constable, which is the basic shit rank. And you have to spend 2 years as a constable before you can be promoted out of that rank. And so my first 2 years were spent doing foot patrol around Cambridge, motor patrol in the Panda cars being the standard patrol cars for the police, called Panda cars because they were originally painted black with white doors. The ones in Cambridgeshire were light blue with white doors. I would do everything. We'd work shifts. You always work shifts in the police, so you'd have an early shift from 7 till 3, the late shift from 3 till 11, and the night shift from 11 till 7. And the system was such, it was quite tiring working shifts, but I didn't mind because I was young in those days. Believe it or not, I was young once. I was 23 when I joined the police. What would happen is you'd do a week of night shifts, and after your last night shift, you would go home at 7 in the morning, sleep a little bit, and go back on duty again at 3 p.m. the same day. And then you worked till 11, and then you were completely dead, and you had 3 days off. It wasn't actually a bad system, because I think they figured that if you were tired anyway, you might as well get even more tired while on their time. Anyway, to come back to what we were saying, I learned in the police something which I sometimes use as a guideline to teach interpreters about stress and about colleagues, that the only way to survive, physically to survive, not be killed, is to approach every incident as if the people involved were going to kill you. Because if you get it wrong once, then you are dead. So that's the attitude you have to have. You approach an incident in the street, you're called, you've no idea what the problem is, you arrive, there's a couple of people squaring off, maybe with knives, maybe with guns, maybe not, you can't tell. You have to approach them as if they were going to kill you because you are the target. The policeman's always the target. And then once you realise that the people are not going to kill you, you can start to become slightly more familiar and more polite and let your guard down. The whole ethos in the British police is you have to be polite and call people sir and call ladies madam on the street. Except in those instances where people would find being called sir patronising, which means you have to get you acquire very quickly a sense for how people are and what way you need to approach each individual person, because somebody who might appreciate being called sir wouldn't appreciate being called mate. Somebody who would appreciate being called mate would hate being called sir, because they would see it as irony and as arrogance. So there's this you soon learn. In fact, being in the police for 10 years stood me in huge stead throughout my life, because it really taught me a lot about human nature. It also showed me a lot about the way people really are. In the police, you spend your whole time dealing with people whose masks have been removed, because you're dealing with emergency situations, and people no longer have this patina, this varnish of civilization. What you see is the real person. And it could be good, and it could be bad. But you do learn how people are, and this has taught me very quickly to see through bullshitters, of which there are a lot, has to be said, especially where I work at NATO, as Felix may find out if he ever comes and works with us. By the way, I wouldn't have recommended you be there today. It was not easy in the booth this morning, and there were lots of Spaniards, as I was saying earlier, so this was particularly pénible. Anyway, to come back to what I was saying, another thing you learn in the police is that you can make a difference. And that was one of the reasons why I joined, because I wanted to actually make a difference, as I still do. I wanted to be in a situation where I could make people's lives better. Now, the great thing about policing is that you can actually save lives, and that is quite an amazing feeling. It's a huge rush. If you save someone's life, it's pretty good. If you fail to save someone's life, it can hurt. I recall at one time I was in the traffic department. I could speak, by the way, for hours about all this, but there probably isn't time for hours of speaking. I spent a year and a half in the traffic department, traffic patrol, which is the high-profile things you see on TV. You know, where you get these videos where traffic police chase people and what they do with things. And that was a hell of a lot of fun, actually being paid to drive fast, which is my idea of nirvana. And I recall one incident where we were called to a chemical spill. It was a lorry which was carrying dangerous chemicals, and it had overturned and caught fire. And it had hit a car, and I had to watch while 4 people burnt to death in that car, and I couldn't do anything about it because the fire was so violent and so strong that we couldn't get anywhere near it, and the people just died in front of me, and that was very, well, it's a lot worse for them, but it was terrible. It remains with me to this day, and it always does. And when you can't help people, this does mark you. But being able to do so is great. I developed also a great line in sarcasm. The police are very good when they stop you at being sarcastic, and I used to love that. It was great fun. I used to perfect my lines that I could bring out to make motorists and other wrongdoers feel bad about themselves. That was a lot of fun. I also tried to act righteously as a police person, in that, to me, there's not always a coincidence between morality and law. Now, any of you who think that the law is actually there to perpetrate and allow justice, you need to rethink your way of looking at the world. The law is a game. The justice system is a game. The police are a game. It's all about playing the game. It's nothing to do with justice. Every now and again, the law may coincide with natural justice and ethics, but it's purely coincidence. And so it took me a few years to realise this, and again, it's one of the reasons why I ended up leaving, because to me, I had signed on to save the world and make people's lives better, and sometimes, in fact very frequently, you were obliged to do the opposite. A good example of that would be when you were arresting a pensioner for stealing a can of soup in Sainsbury's. Now, to me, that is not right. I know the law says you can't steal, and it has to be said that the amount of property-related law there is shows you how much we are based in our society on possessing things, because there's so much property-based law. Anyway, if we're called by the manager of Sainsbury's to arrest an old lady who's got no money and is on a pension and can't afford to eat for stealing a can of soup, that is just plain wrong. But you can't say to the manager, piss off, I'm not arresting her. You have to do it, or there'll be a complaint, and you'll get in trouble. And the fact that you couldn't you weren't able within the law to appreciate all the shades of grey there are in human lives is something which I found very hard. And most policemen didn't. They said it's a law, simple as that, but to me it's not as simple as that. I learnt very early on that in most instances involving crime and the emergency services, things are very grey. Things are very rarely right or wrong, black or white. They're not binary. And there was always, or very frequently, a good reason why people did what they did. Perhaps they were desperate, perhaps they could see no other way out, perhaps life had never actually given them the ability to stand back and make a choice, as you or I probably would be able to do. And they got themselves painted into a corner and there was nothing else they could do. Murderers, I met quite a few murderers. Obviously I was in the Serious Crime Squad for 2 years, which is also called the Regional Crime Squad. That's the squads that deal with homicide and robbery. In America it'll be robbery, homicide. And there you deal with the higher level criminals, as it were. And most murderers are not bad people. Most murderers momentarily can't cope. They lash out, they might be unlucky and kill someone, they might be lucky and just knock them over and they get a bruise. And they've murdered somebody. But they're not bad people. There are people, obviously, who make a career out of murder. They are bad people. Professional killers, professional organised crime people. But most murderers are not bad people. They simply were in the wrong place at the wrong time and couldn't cope. And I can certainly relate to people being what the French call dépassés par les événements and not being able to cope with what's going on around them. That makes 16 minutes. That's too much, isn't it? I need to stop. Okay? We can have the next episode whenever you like. I have much more to say. Goodbye and thank you.